Welcome, Jane. Thank you so much for doing this interview with me.
It's my pleasure.
We're going to talk about white heterosexual men that have sex with men, and I'm curious to talk more about the white part of that because it's obviously you're insinuating that it's different than maybe for men of color. So I am going to first of all read your bio here. Jane Ward is professor of gender and sexuality studies at University of California, Riverside, where she teaches courses in feminist, queer, and heterosexuality studies. And she's the author of Not Gay, Sex Between Straight White Men, which has been featured in Newsweek, New York Magazine, Forbes, The Guardian, Huffington Post, Salon, and Vice. Her first book, Respectably Queer, Diversity, Culture, and LGBT Activist Organizations, was named by the Progressive magazine as a best book of 2008. Currently, Ward is working on a monograph titled The Failure of Heterosexuality, How Sexism Doomed the World's Cherished Union and Hid the Wreckage. That sounds like a fascinating book as well, Jane. So let's start by talking about your book and why you wrote that book.
Sure. Well, that I will tell you is the number one question that is asked by journalists who always say some version of, what's a nice lesbian like you doing writing a book like this about men? So, the answer to that is that the seed for this book was actually planted 20 years ago when I was in college. Maybe it's longer than that now. And I had a straight white male friend of mine who was at a university in Southern California share with me about a hazing ritual that he had participated in called the Elephant Walk. This was a fraternity hazing ritual. And in this ritual, which it turns out has been well documented by anthropologists and sexologists, fraternity pledges, take off their clothes and they put one thumb in the anus of the pledge in front of them and then hold the hand or the penis of the pledge behind them. And they're sort of walking around in a circle like circus elephants connected tail to trunk. And when he told me this story, I was in my early 20s, I was shocked to hear this. And he told me so casually, as if it would be clear to me, as if it were self-evident that this was not sexual in any way. This was just sort of boys being boys. This was fraternity antics. And then I just, that kind of was on my radar, this way that straight men would touch each other either in the locker room or in the military or in the hallways of high school, and in ways that seem very sexual, and certainly we would find sexual if girls and women participated in them, but that they didn't view as sexual at all. So it was really my interest in understanding why we perceive straight women's sexual touching of one another differently than we perceive when men touch one another. That was the impetus for the project.
I see. So, and then why 20 years later did you decide to write about it finally?
Yeah, I think a couple of things were going on that made me realize that this was actually a book length project. So in the early 2000s, the New York Times ran a story about the down low. And this is a term that's now commonly used to refer primarily to African American men in the U.S., sometimes also Latino men, now sometimes white men. But originally it was really about African American men who are straight identified, who have often wives or girlfriends, who have no interest in being gay or bi, but who have sex with men. And the article portrayed this as very racialized, that this is something that Black men do because of hyperhomophobia in the Black community that makes it impossible for them to come out and be honest about their true bisexuality or homosexuality. And the There was also at the time the beginning of this fascination that's now very familiar to all of us of girl on girl action, that kind of left, it had been specific to pornography. That's been going on for a long time, but it entered the mainstream with Madonna and Britney Spears, making out with each other at the Video Music Awards. And then it just became very normalized that we would see constantly, there would be ubiquitous presence of same-sex eroticism among girls used in the media to sell products and so forth to entertain us. And so absent in this hyper representation of what men of color were doing and what women were doing was white men. What about white men? Why are we not talking about them? Is this really implying that they don't behave in these kind of behaviors, or that they don't engage in these kind of behaviors? And so it was precisely all of the conversation that was happening about men of color and about women that led me to ask the question, what about white men?
I see. And is there difference between white men and African American men who engage in sex with men when they're heterosexual?
Yes, but I think it's important to say that it's not so much in the behaviors that people are engaged in or the sexual activity itself. It's that all of us, people of color, white people, men, women, are embedded in our cultural context, and our cultural context determines what tools, what rhetorical or discursive tools we have available to us to justify our behavior when it seems like it's in contradiction with our identity. So I talk about this often as loopholes, that if you're a straight person, in general, the rule is you can never engage in homosexual sex, or someone's going to say, wait a second, you're not straight. Except there are a few loopholes, and what they look like for women is different from what they look like for men, and what they look like for men of color is different from what they look like for white men. White men often draw on this sort of bro dude kind of white male identity that is about bonding with other white men in a way that they perceive to be very casual and often meaningless and often not sexual at all. So paradoxically, straight white men will often make a lot of sexual contact with each other while at precisely the same time that they're making homophobic jokes, that they're calling each other fag. You see this particularly with boys in junior high and high school and into college, that white boys will mount each other or slap each other on the butt or even grab each other's penis, and then after doing that, sort of back up, laugh, and call the other person a fag. So it's actually that kind of homosexual contact is a way of expressing homophobia. It's sort of like, if we can pretend to do this and then make a show of how pretend it was, then we can actually distinguish ourselves from those real gays for whom that kind of touching has a romantic meaning or an emotional meaning. And so, interestingly, this carries on into the military, where there is a tremendous amount of homosexual contact. One of the rituals that I look at, or the initiation ceremonies I look at in my book, is the Navy's Crossing the Line ceremony, which is a ceremony or an initiation rite in which sailors who are aboard ship and crossing the equator for the first time undergo this initiation that's very much focused on the anus. It's a lot of older sailors shoving food and other objects into their anus, and then ordering other new sailors to remove it with their mouths. Basically, a lot of mouth to anus contact. I think what's important to recognize is that if we knew that women were creating rituals in which they asked one another to lick each other's anuses or demanded this, of subordinate women, we would be able to recognize that power was at play here. But we would also say there's something sexual going on. But interestingly, with men, especially with white men, because of white privilege, they have tremendous resources available to them to perceive that activity as not only not gay, but also not sexual at all. The perception is this is just about joking. This is about being part of the team. This is about, in the military, there's even a discourse about how, you have to toughen up the male soldier's body in the service of national security. So some of this sort of, shoving things into the anus is actually about, protecting the nation. And so there's all of these justificatory logics that come into play when straight white men touch each other that destigmatizes it, that desexualizes it. Whereas when men of color engage in that kind of behavior, even if it's in an institutional context like a prison, it gets queered because their sexuality is typically viewed by the dominant culture as already a little suspect. Black men are overly sexual or have predatory sexuality. So their sexuality is hyper scrutinized in a way that it's not for white men.
So that's kind of the main difference, is just how we see it as a society.
Yes, absolutely.
So when you're talking about, these initiation rituals, is it that, basically the men are denying that it's a sexual act, that, that they're making a statement that they're not homosexuals or gay themselves, and yet there must be some pleasure in it that they're also denying, some sexual pleasure that they're denying?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's tempting for many people to look at these kinds of hazing interactions and say, well, really, we should be calling this rape, or we should be calling it bullying. And there's nothing sexual going on here at all. But what's interesting is that, another part of the research that I've conducted is looking at personal ads online. And in one study, I collected 125 ads from Craigslist Los Angeles that were posted by people claiming to be straight white men seeking sex with other straight white men. Now, this is the internet, so they could be perhaps not those people. But what is interesting about these ads is that the content of the ads, it shows us how it is that people turn a homosexual encounter into a heterosexual encounter in their own perception and in the kinds of references that they're making. And so here are men who, they're not in the military, they're not in a fraternity, they're just in their living room and they want to get a blowjob from another man. But they often will reference the institution, whether it be the military or the fraternity or boarding school or something like that, as part of the erotic script that helps to heterosexualize what kind of this sexual encounter. So they might say something like, remember back when, jacking off with another man wasn't about being gay, it was just about being buddies. Well, that's what I'm looking for. I just want a relaxed, chill, friend to jack off with side by side, this kind of thing. And so I think that absolutely we see both an institutional context that often is about hierarchy and dominance and sometimes violence, but it's also precisely the context that facilitates men's capacity to touch one another. Because interestingly, to express romantic or even romantic attachment or pleasure vis-a-vis another man is perceived as very, very gay. But if you can do it in a way that is perceived as dominant and sometimes men will even describe their sexual contact with each other as kind of like an extreme sport. Like, do you have the balls to do this? Like, let's say if you're a real man, because a real man could get a blowjob from another man and not be gay. So, so I think pleasure and power, I guess the point I'm making is that when we're looking at male sexuality, it's always a complex nexus of pleasure and power.
And how do you distinguish men who are maybe, latent homosexual, gay, but they are from these heterosexual men that primarily identify as being heterosexual?
Right. Yeah. So, one misconception about the argument that I have made in my book is that I'm describing some subset of men, some particular subpopulation of men who, are straight but have sex with men on the side. What I'm arguing is that actually all boys and men are part of institutions like school, where this kind of touching is completely normalized. It's built into the very fabric of heterosexual masculinity. And so it's not like, well, there's this one kinky community of straight men who like to do this. So if we recognize that potentially all straight men have this capacity, it complicates the question that you're asking a bit. What I would say is that increasingly, I think we're becoming aware that there's a difference between sexual activity, how people behave, and sexual culture. So you might be a straight identified man who has an interest in sometimes getting a blowjob or giving a blowjob with another man, but you have no interest whatsoever in gay subculture. There's nothing about that appeals to you. You're completely invested in heteronormativity. You want to be with women, you want to marry a woman, you want to be, part of straight culture, and all of your political and cultural and emotional investments lie there. And you also have this sexual curiosity. I think it's a mistake to force a person who feels that way to say, but come on, you're really bisexual or you're really gay. I think people, when they want to come out as bisexual or they want to come out as gay or lesbian, it's because heterosexuality as a cultural structure just doesn't suit them. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like home. I think if we can see this far more clearly with young women, we know that young women are increasingly open to having sex with another woman because their boyfriend asked them to please him for his birthday or whatever. Or at straight clubs, it's very common now to see women very sexually engaged with one another, dancing in an erotic way with each other for the pleasure of men. We don't look at that and say, when we don't look at that straight club where these two women are touching each other and say, oh, this is such a tragic situation. These women are repressed lesbians who need to come out of the closet. We don't say that because we recognize that is homosexual or homoerotic contact that's in the service of heterosexuality. It has nothing to do with lesbian culture. Whereas there are other people like myself, for instance, who felt really repulsed by straight culture. Everything about it. It wasn't just men's bodies. It was the way men interacted with me. It was the sexism that runs through straight culture. It was, all of the norms about how men and women are supposed to interact with each other. It was really those cultural norms that pushed me away from imagining myself as straight, and pushed me toward what was a far more appealing cultural experience of being a lesbian. So I guess I would say people are bisexual or they're gay or lesbian when they tell you they are, when they feel a longing for those things, to be part of those communities, when they feel that pull. Otherwise, if someone's telling you, I'm straight, but I occasionally like to give blowjobs to men, they're straight and they occasionally like to give blowjobs to men.
Do you have any sense outside of these ritualistic cultural experiences, like, for example, the men that are running Craigslist ads, of men that are actually seeking like the one-on-one, actually seeking men for this sexual contact? Do you have a sense of how prevalent that is? Is there research on that?
Well, there are sociologists who actually have contacted those men on Craigslist, for instance, and conducted one-on-one interviews with them. I don't have a sense of how statistically common it is, except that we do see with these sort of general social survey, the public health data that's coming out both in the UK and in the US, that for younger people, I think the age group was 18 to 30, the number of people who identify as not fully straight is increasing dramatically. These are people who don't identify as gay or bisexual, but also don't identify as fully straight in their desires, possibly also in their sex practices. We see a lot, there's more movement there for women because there's more cultural permission for women, but that's changing for men as well.
I was reading something the other day that was saying when you did these surveys with people, are you gay, straight, or bi, that if you asked that, the numbers were actually lower than if you started asking more indirect questions. The numbers rose up like substantially when you started asking, just more indirect questions about behaviors and different situations. So what do you think this, what do you think this all means for us, as sexual beings in this world? Where do you think this is going, and what do you think this all means?
Well, I think what it means, kind of circling back to what we were just talking about these identity labels, is that human sexuality is incredibly complex and fluid. And yet we have a very rigid binary way of thinking about sexuality. For one thing, we could have imagined sexual difference or sexual diversity in any number of ways, but instead we're kind of obsessed as a culture with the gender of people, of our sex partners. So if someone asks you your sexual orientation, you don't say, well, I love anal sex. No, we know that they're asking you, what is the gender of people that you have sex with? We're kind of obsessed with that. There was, interestingly, an effort in the 19th century among European physicians to create even more categories of bad sexualities. So one that they worked on very vigorously was to create the masturbator personality type. This was at the same time that European physicians invented the terms heterosexual and homosexual. There was also an effort to classify people as either masturbators or non-masturbators, and to understand masturbators to be biologically deficient, or to be suffering from some kind of physical aberration, just like they perceived homosexuality. You can imagine how the world would be different if that had happened. You'd have to, if you were a masturbator, which I presume most of us are, you'd have to call your mom and come out on the phone to her as a masturbator. You'd go to masturbator bars and pride parades, because now we understand sexuality through this lens of identity. You would have to announce to the world, I'm a masturbator. But that didn't happen. So we don't think of masturbation that way. We think of masturbation as just, either you do it or you don't do it, but it doesn't define who you are. Instead, with homosexuality or with the gender of sex partners, we've decided that this is something so significant that it marks you as a particular type of person, more significant and than what kinds of sex acts you like to engage in, more significant than your erotic self-perception, more significant than whether you like multiple partners or monogamy. We're kind of obsessed with it. I hope that where all of this recognition of sexual fluidity is leading us is to a place where we can turn that obsession down a notch so that we become interested in other parts of the full spectrum of sexual diversity, other than just this obsession with whether or not people have sex with men or women.
Yeah. And, the whole concept of fluidity is just that most of us are on that continuum of somewhere.
Yes. And it's not, the problem with continuum models is that often people perceive, okay, well, that means there's this continuum of options and everybody's somewhere on the continuum, and then they're always in that space on the continuum. There is a way that people will kind of essentialize even the continuum. I would say, it's fine to have a continuum model as long as you can allow for the possibility that people might in their lifetime move all over that continuum.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For our mainstream society, this is mind-boggling information. It's just totally mind-boggling. And actually, I just discovered this whole idea a few months ago, and I was quite surprised by it too. I couldn't believe that I hadn't heard about it, but now it makes so much sense. I know you're not a therapist, and there are therapists watching and listening to this. Can you, in any way, comment on what you think might be some implications for therapists for this?
Sure. Yeah. I think one really important implication to my mind is that one way that therapists can really best serve their clients by not imposing a rigid sexual identity script that they bring with them as a practitioner onto their client. So like I said before, if a client is saying, I'm straight, let's say a male client, I'm straight, I'm married to a woman, but I can't stop thinking about penises and, or I'm thinking about giving men blowjobs. I think there would be a temptation there for the therapist to think, oh, our work is going to be all about getting this person to come out as gay. Instead, I would suggest shifting the focus to, why, first of all, is it possible to have both of those things? Is it possible that in this marriage, this man could just have fantasies about penises? Could that be okay with his wife? Could it be okay with his wife that he gives other men blowjobs? Now, for most women, that's not going to be okay. So then the question becomes, all right, what are we going to do with the fact that you have this desire for something that, can't really be contained in the relationship that you're in? That's a different framing from you're gay and you're in denial about it. I was contacted recently by a woman who, I get a lot of mail in response to my book. And this woman, is married. She's dating a man and they've been together for a year. And she found out that he had been giving blowjobs to men. And she found this out through reading his text messages on his phone. She's absolutely devastated. But what was striking to me is that the nature of her devastation is really about the fact that he is being with men, that he's engaging this behavior with men. Whereas to my mind, the problem is really the deceit. He's been engaging in this behavior and he's lied to her about it. So that's a good example of how gender can be made less salient in these situations by really focusing on, well, it sounds like there's a breakdown in trust here. Number one, let's start there.
Hmm. So you're getting a lot of letters from people. I imagine, are you getting a lot of letters from men who fit into this category?
Yes.
And can you just share some of what they're saying or asking or why they're writing to you?
Yeah. Mostly these are men who just want to make themselves available to me as research subjects. They found out about the book and they have a particularly interesting story to tell. Some of these men are married to women who know everything about their sex with men and and they've come to some kind of healthy agreement around it. And so they wanted to share that with me because they recognize that that's unusual. I have heard from some men who are in relationships with women who don't know that they are involved with men. And when I say involved, I mean, sometimes, like one man wrote to me, and his whole interest is just mutual masturbation. He doesn't want to touch other men. He takes videos of himself sometimes masturbating and posts them online, and other men comment on these videos. So, he's trying to come up with ways to fulfill this interest that he has, that he thinks, maybe aren't cheating, that aren't going to violate the terms of the relationship. Still, though, if your partner would be distressed to find this out, then there's an issue there around trust. So yes, I think a lot of these men are just wanting to share with me the particular ways that this plays out in their own lives, and are also wanting to, they're expressing that they're grateful that there's more of a conversation about this.
Well, and I imagine you must get some from men that find relief, like, oh my God, there's other men out there, or, I'm not gay. I thought I was gay, but I'm not gay, or whatever. Or I was confused about my identity. But now I understand that it's not abnormal. It's a common thing. So are you going to be doing more research on this area, or do you feel like you're kind of done with it for now?
I feel like I'm kind of done with it. I think the book will come out in second edition, and I am excited to write a new introduction because I have learned a tremendous amount just in the last year since the book came out. People have contacted me from around the world sharing stories about what this, there's tremendous cultural variation in what this looks like. And so I've heard from men in their 60s who have talked about, how there's they've encountered this kind of this kind of activity on the road when they're sort of RVing with their wives at natural hot springs. And I've heard from people describing same-sex sexual encounters between men in Latin America and Russia and Africa and China, and each of these letters that comes to me is describing there's the common thread of same-sex sexual activity among people who don't identify as gay, but incredibly different cultural context. So I'm excited to address that.
So what are some of the issues that vary amongst cultures that you might want to comment on right now?
Sure. Well, again, it's different institutional environments are often what facilitates this sort of behavior. There's always a justifying or rationalizing logic that is made available, and where and how that's made available is what's different. So in Russia, for instance, there's a lot of this kind of sexual activity in the criminal underground, men who are kind of pushing goods on the black market, who are away from family, and within that subculture has developed this practice and a justification for the practice that I presume is about, there aren't women available. This is a sort of masculine male bonding kind of activity. Similarly, I've heard from journalists in Latin America who've talked about boarding schools there being places where, or schools where boys are living in, being places where you can engage in same-sex sexual activity and not have it be perceived as gay. You see that also in the U.S., that there's a kind of developmental psychological discourse about coming of age and so forth. But that extends into the 20s in some instances, that there's this window of forgiveness. So to me, that's really fascinating, is that it's often so how we understand the normalcy or abnormalcy of our sex practices are not just culturally embedded, but they're often institutionally embedded.
Jane, is there anything in your book or anything else you have on this topic that we haven't touched on here? I mean, there's a lot more, I'm sure, in your book, but is there any topic that we haven't touched on that you think is important to address?
Yeah, I think I have touched on the problem of bioessentialism, but I just want to maybe end with that, which is that, it's fascinating to me that at the same time that we see an increase in the general public's belief that sexual orientation is hardwired or congenital, we also see an increase in sexual fluidity. And so even though those might seem like they're in contradiction with one another, part of what I address in the book is that that these bioessentialist narratives are expansive enough to actually incorporate or subsume sexual fluidity. So what this looks like on the ground is that that if you believe that you were either born a heterosexual or born a homosexual, then you can engage in behavior that is, strays from that fundamental constitution, but still feel secure that, no matter what I do, no matter how much I, touch another guy, I know that I'm straight because I believe that I am genetically or hormonally straight. And so that, I think, on the one hand, there's kind of a tension between this idea that, all of sexuality is expanding and is incredibly fluid, but also that we have these rigid, only 3 biological options that are determined by things that happen to us in the womb. And so there are some tensions there, but in a way, one is also enabling the other. I think straight people feel far more authorization to experiment with sexuality because they imagine themselves to be biologically heterosexual. That's very different from how we would have thought about it just 50 years ago, when really even effeminacy in men, some sort of gender nonconformity was perceived to be the telltale sign of homosexuality. Certainly anyone that ever behaved homosexually was understood to be a homosexual, even if that had just happened one time, no matter what the circumstance, because homosexuality was more of a psychological condition. Now that we understand it to be a biological condition, that really changes possibilities for behavior. So I think that's important to, I think this is an unanswered question, but for us to also think about, what is the story that we're telling ourselves about where sexual orientation comes from, and how does that produce certain kinds of logics, or kind of foreclose other ways of thinking about sexuality.
Mm-hmm. It'll be interesting to see in the next 20 years, for example, where this all goes, for sure. Jane, thank you so much. It was awesome.
You're so welcome. I had a great time.